He returned to his hometown after 20 years of running from his own story. He thought he had buried the past, until he crossed paths with the gaze of the woman who had marked his youth. If you like love and romance stories, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave your comment saying where you're listening from. The helicopter cut through the orange sky of rural Virginia like a metallic scar, and Gabriel Foster observed from the window the horizon he hadn't seen in 20 years. Maple Ridge stretched below him like a poorly healed wound, with its exposed brick houses and dusty streets that seemed frozen in time. The sound of the helicopter blades echoed through the dry hills, announcing the arrival of someone the town preferred to forget. At 42, Gabe had transformed into the kind of man business magazines loved to photograph: perfectly styled salt and pepper hair, tailored Italian suit, a watch that cost more than an entire family's annual income. Founder and CEO of Foster Tech, one of the country's largest technology companies, he owned apartments in New York, Miami, and London, luxury cars, and a bank account that grew faster than he could spend. But none of that mattered at this moment, as the pilot prepared to land in the dried field that was once his childhood backyard. The Foster property occupied a considerable area on the outskirts of Maple Ridge. The main house, built in the colonial style, still maintained its imposing presence, but Gabe could see the neglect of recent years. Loose shingles, poorly maintained gardens, paint peeling under the unforgiving sun. His father, Colonel Anthony Foster, had died 3 days earlier at 78, alone in that mansion that once housed an entire family. Gabe descended from the helicopter with the same cold expression he used in board meetings. There were no tears, no nostalgia, just the mechanical fulfillment of an obligation. He came to sign papers, sell the property, and leave again, definitively abandoning any trace that connected him to that cursed place. But Gabe's plans began to crumble before he even stepped onto the house's porch. Waiting for him, with a straw hat in his hands and downcast eyes, was Joe, the caretaker who had worked for the family for more than 30 years. The man had aged, his hair now completely white, his calloused hands trembling slightly as he approached. "Welcome back, Mr. Gabe," said Joe, using the same respectful treatment from when Gabe was a child. "I'm sorry for the loss of the Colonel." Gabe merely nodded, avoiding any display of emotion. He entered the house and was immediately hit by the familiar smell: old wood, beeswax, and that indefinable aroma that all old houses carry, a mixture of memories and mildew that stuck in the throat like a knot. His father's office remained exactly as he remembered: the solid mahogany desk, the shelves filled with books no one read, the framed portrait of his grandfather in military uniform. On the desk, piles of documents awaited his attention, but it was a sealed letter with his name that caught his eye first. Joe remained hesitantly at the door. "The Colonel left this for you, said it was to be delivered as soon as you arrived." Gabe took the letter and tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket without opening it. He wasn't ready to hear the last words of the man he'd spent his entire life trying to forget. "When is the funeral?" he asked, leafing through the documents on the desk. "Tomorrow at 3 in the afternoon, at the municipal cemetery." "Everything's already arranged as the Colonel requested," Gabe nodded. 24 hours and he would be free forever. But as he organized the papers, a photograph slipped from between the pages of an old court case. It was a photo from the local school, taken during a summer festival. He must have been about 16, dressed up as a country boy, smiling in a way he could no longer remember how to do. And beside him, with long braids and a gingham dress, was Hannah Lewis. Gabe's chest tightened in a way he hadn't felt in years. Hannah, the seamstress's daughter, the girl from the neighboring orchard, the owner of the first kiss he had given and the only love he had known. Her eyes in the photograph shone with that intensity that haunted him to this day, a mixture of sweetness and melancholy that made him a completely lost boy. "Joe," he called, still looking at the photo. "Hannah, does she still live here?" The caretaker frowned, visible discomfort crossing his face. "Yes, sir. She lives in old Mrs. Lucy's house, past the orchard, works at the school library, and—" "Did she get married?" Joe slowly shook his head. "No, sir, never married. She's lived alone since her mother died about 5 years ago." But what?" "Nothing, sir, just that, well, people say she's not much for conversation, lives kind of closed off, you know how it is." Gabe put the photograph in his pocket, along with his father's letter. Suddenly, his rush to leave had considerably diminished. There was something unfinished in that town, something he had left behind 20 years ago that now pulsed in his chest like a poorly healed wound. That night, lying in his old childhood bed, Gabe couldn't sleep. Through the window, he could see the lights of the house where Hannah lived, a simple two-story building painted light blue, surrounded by the same blackberry orchard where they used to meet as teenagers. The house was dark, but he knew she was there, just a few yards away after all these years. He got up and went to the window, resting his hands on the wooden sill. The Lewis property bordered the Fosters, separated only by a barbed wire fence that, at the time, united them more than it separated them. How many times had he jumped that fence to meet her? How many afternoons had they spent talking under the shade of the blackberry trees, making plans for a future that never came? His clearest memory of Hannah was from the last day they spent together. It was the eve of the summer festival. She was 17, he was 18. They had kissed with desperate urgency, their hands exploring forbidden territories while fireworks exploded in the sky. She had whispered in his ear that she loved him, and he had replied that they would run away together, that they would build a life far from there, far from the prejudices and social differences that separated them. The next day, everything fell apart. The scandal exploded on a Sunday morning, when the bells of the main church still echoed through the hills, and families were preparing for Sunday lunch. Gabe remembered every detail of that day, as if it were a scar engraved in his memory. The sound of the front door being broken down, his mother's screams, the sound of his father's heavy footsteps coming down the stairs with a fury he had never witnessed. Colonel Anthony Foster was a man of explosive temperament, known in the region for resolving issues with iron fists and cutting words. But that morning his anger had a specific target. Lucy Lewis, Hannah's mother, who according to malicious rumors spread through town, had dared to tell some neighbors about certain favors the colonel had asked for in exchange for loans to maintain the family's livelihood. The official version, which circulated through the bars and grocery stores of Maple Ridge, was that Lucy had invented slanderous stories about the colonel to justify her own financial difficulties. But Gabe, even at 18, could read between the lines what had really happened. His father was a predator, and Lucy had made the mistake of trying to expose him. Gabe could still hear the sound of his father's pickup truck accelerating down the dirt road toward the Lewis property. He had run after it, his heart pounding in his chest, foreseeing a tragedy. When he arrived, he found his father in the family's yard, shouting at Lucy, who had a swollen face and blood running from her nose. "You lying whore!" the colonel shouted, grabbing Lucy by the hair. "You think you can go around spreading lies about me? You think anyone will believe a lowly seamstress?" Hannah was standing at the door of the house, paralyzed with terror, watching her mother being humiliated and assaulted. Her eyes met Gabe's, and at that moment he saw something break inside her, like a crystal shattering into 1,000 pieces. Gabe had tried to intervene, but his father pushed him with such force that he fell to the packed dirt ground. "This is none of your business, boy. Go home and mind your own life." But Gabe couldn't move. He stayed there, on his knees on the ground, watching the man he was supposed to respect destroy the life of the woman who had raised the girl he loved. And worse, feeling too cowardly to do anything that might stop that violence. The colonel had left only when he finished making his threats. He told Lucy that if she ever made up stories again, he would ensure that she and her daughter wouldn't find work anywhere in the region, that he knew important people, that he had influence, that he could make their lives hell if he wanted. When they were finally alone, Gabe tried to approach Hannah, but she backed away like a wounded animal. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "Don't come near me." "Hannah, I can explain. My father didn't... Your father nearly killed my mother," she cut him off, her voice trembling with anger and pain. "And you just stood there watching." The accusation was like a punch to the stomach. Gabe knew she was right. He had stood there paralyzed by cowardice and the complexity of a situation his 18-year-old mind couldn't fully process. "I didn't know what to do," he murmured. You knew exactly what to do," Hannah replied, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You had to stand by your family, as always." That night Gabe had tried to talk to his father, to demand explanations, to understand what had really happened. But the colonel was drunk in his office, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and that distant look he always assumed when he wanted to end a conversation. "Easy, woman," he muttered without raising his eyes from the desk. Thought she could take advantage of me, make up stories to get easy money. Taught her not to mess with a serious man. What stories? Gabe insisted. What did she say? The colonel finally looked at his son, and there was something dangerous in that gaze. Nothing you need to know, boy, and I hope you're smart enough not to get mixed up in this. The Foster family has a name to uphold in this town. But Gabe had grown up in that house long enough to recognize when his father was lying. He had grown up hearing the whispered conversations among the employees, seeing the way some women in town lowered their heads when the colonel passed by. Noticing the uncomfortable looks his mother gave her husband on certain occasions. The next day, early in the morning, the colonel had called Gabe for a private conversation. He said he had arranged a place for him at a private college in Richmond, that it was time for the boy to see the world, to make something of his life, that staying in that small town wouldn't lead anywhere. You're leaving tomorrow, he declared, as if it were a military order. Everything's already arranged. Apartment, tuition, allowance. You're going to study business administration, and when you graduate, you'll work with me in the company. Gabe had tried to protest, to say he didn't want to leave, that there were things that kept him there. But his father's look allowed no discussion. There's nothing in this town for you, my son. Nothing but problems and complications that can harm your future. It was obvious that the colonel was referring to Hannah. It was obvious that this forced departure was both a punishment and a protection, a way to separate his son from a situation that could become inconvenient for the family's business and reputation. Gabe had spent his last night in Maple Ridge awake, looking out his bedroom window toward Hannah's house. He thought about jumping the fence one more time, about knocking on her window, about saying goodbye properly. He thought about promising that he would return, that he would find a way for them to be together, that their love was stronger than any obstacle. But he did none of that. He left the next morning without saying goodbye, taking only a suitcase and the weight of cowardice in his chest. He looked out the car window as he drove away, watching the silhouette of Maple Ridge diminish on the horizon, and swore to himself that one day he would return to get Hannah. 20 years later he had finally returned, but not to get her. He had returned only to bury the past once and for all. Or at least that's what he was trying to convince himself as he prepared for his father's funeral, knowing that in a few hours he would be face to face with the only woman he had truly loved in his life. The Maple Ridge Municipal Cemetery occupied a low hill on the outskirts of town, surrounded by ancient cypress trees that swayed gently under the hot afternoon wind. Gabe arrived a few minutes before the scheduled time, wearing a black suit that contrasted violently with the rustic environment around him. The heat was suffocating, but he kept his jacket buttoned like armor against the memories that insisted on sprouting with each step. There were more people than he expected, farmers from the region, merchants from town, former employees of the family, all maintaining a respectful distance, as they observed the prodigal son with poorly disguised curiosity. Gabe recognized some aged faces, people he had known as a child, but made no effort to greet anyone beyond what was strictly necessary. The Methodist church pastor conducted a simple protocol ceremony. He spoke about the importance of Colonel Anthony Foster to the community, about his contribution to the development of the region, about the legacy he left for his son. Empty words that echoed through the hot air without finding an echo in Gabe's heart. It was when they began to lower the coffin that he saw her. Hannah was standing in the shade of a cypress tree, away from the main group of mourners, observing the ceremony in silence. 20 years had passed, but Gabe recognized her immediately, as if time were just an illusion that collapsed with a single glance. She was still beautiful, but in a different, more mature way. Her hair remained long and brown, but was now tied in a low bun that highlighted the delicate shape of her face. She wore a simple black dress and flat shoes, her hands crossed in front of her body in a posture that mixed respect and discomfort. But it was her eyes that hit him like a punch to the chest. They still carried that intensity, he remembered, but now there was something more. A deep shadow, a sadness that seemed to have permanently settled in her gaze. It was as if she had seen too much, suffered too much, matured in a way that hurt just to observe. She noticed him looking, and, for a moment, their eyes met across the space that separated them. There was no surprise in her expression, no anger, no easily identifiable emotion. It was an empty look, as if she were looking through him, seeing something that he himself couldn't see. Gabe felt the world spin slightly. 20 years of expensive therapy, of frustrated relationships, of professional achievements, of attempts to convince himself that he had overcome the past. Everything collapsed in those few seconds of eye contact. When the ceremony ended and people began to disperse, he lost sight of her. He searched among the cypress trees, walked through the flower beds withered by the sun, but Hannah had disappeared like a mirage in the desert. Looking for someone? The voice behind him made him turn abruptly. It was her, standing a few yards away, her hands still crossed in front of her body. Up close he could see the small signs that the years had left. Fine wrinkles around her eyes, a small scar on her left temple that he didn't remember from before, the slightly sunburned skin of someone who worked a lot and took little care of herself. Hannah. The name left his mouth like a broken prayer. Gabriel. She responded with the voice he still heard in dreams, just a few tones deeper than in adolescence, carrying a serenity that sounded almost dangerous. They stood there, sizing each other up like two wild animals meeting in a clearing. The wind swayed the branches of the cypress trees above their heads, creating dancing shadows on the packed dirt ground between them. "I'm sorry about your father's death," she finally said, her voice neutral without traces of irony or resentment. Gabe almost choked on his own response. "You don't need to lie out of politeness." An almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of Hannah's mouth. "I'm not lying. I really am sorry. Death is always a loss, regardless of who dies. Even after everything he did to you and your mother?" Hannah tilted her head slightly, as if carefully considering the question. "Especially because of that. His death closes a door that perhaps I needed to see closed." Gabe didn't know what to say. He had imagined this reunion 1,000 times over the years, creating elaborate dialogues in his mind, preparing explanations and requests for forgiveness. But reality was completely different from his fantasies. Hannah wasn't furious. She wasn't accusing him. She wasn't shedding tears or slapping him in the face. She was just there, serene and distant, treating him like a polite stranger. Are you okay?" The question sounded pathetic even to himself. "I'm alive," she replied, and there was something somber in that response that he couldn't decipher. "I heard you work at the school library." "Yes, it's a quiet job. I like the silence." Gabe swallowed hard. There were a million things he wanted to say, questions he wanted to ask, apologies he wanted to make, but nothing seemed appropriate for that moment, in that place before this woman who was both the Hannah he had loved and a complete stranger. "Will you be staying in town long?" she asked, and there was something in the way she asked the question that suggested the answer was important to her. "I don't know. I need to resolve some inheritance matters." Hannah nodded slowly. "The property is large. Must be a lot to organize." "Hannah, Gabe began, but she raised one of her hands, interrupting him. "No," she said softly but firmly. "Not here. Not now." She turned to leave, but after a few steps, she stopped and looked over her shoulder. "If you really want to talk, come find me. You know where to find me." And then she left, walking among the tombstones with measured steps, leaving Gabe alone among the cypress trees with his heart beating as if he had run a marathon. That night, he couldn't get Hannah out of his head. Every word she had said, every expression that had crossed her face, every second of that encounter was obsessively dissected and analyzed in his mind. There was something different about her, something that went far beyond the simple passage of time. He was lying on his childhood bed, looking at the dark wooden ceiling, when he finally admitted to himself the truth he had been avoiding for hours. He still loved her. After 20 years, after dozens of other women, after having built an entire life elsewhere, he was still hopelessly in love with Hannah Lewis, and that terrified him more than any risky business or corporate decision he had ever made in his life. Gabe spent 3 days trying to convince himself that he shouldn't seek out Hannah. 3 days organizing papers in his father's office, talking to lawyers about selling the property, avoiding looking out the window toward the blue house that stood on the other side of the orchard. But on the 4th morning, when he woke up with the sun rising over the hills, he knew he couldn't leave without talking to her properly. The walk to the Lewis property was like a journey through time. The same wooden gate painted white, now peeling and slightly crooked. The same stone path that led to the house surrounded by blackberry bushes that had grown and spread, creating a dense, cool shade. Even the smell was the same. Moist earth, ripe fruit, and that indefinable perfume of a house inhabited by women who knew how to cook. The house, painted light blue as Joe had mentioned, maintained the simple structure as always. 2 stories, front porch, red clay roof tiles. But it was well maintained, with flower boxes in the windows and a small vegetable garden in the back that he could glimpse from the side of the building. Gabe hesitated at the front door, his hand raised to knock. What exactly did he intend to say? How do you start a conversation that was interrupted 20 years ago? How do you ask forgiveness for a cowardice that changed the course of 2 lives? Before he could knock, the door opened. Hannah was standing in the doorway, wearing a simple cotton print dress and flip-flops, her hair loose falling over her shoulders. There was something domestic and welcoming about her appearance that contrasted violently with the serious, distant woman he had met at the cemetery. "I was expecting you," she said, stepping aside so he could enter. The living room of the house was small and cozy, decorated with simple but well-preserved furniture. There were books scattered everywhere, on improvised shelves stacked on the coffee table, open on chairs as if she had been interrupted during reading. The walls were decorated with photographs in wooden frames, most in black and white, depicting moments from Hannah and her mother's life. "Would you like coffee?" she asked, moving toward the kitchen with the naturalness of someone who was used to receiving visitors. "Please." Gabe followed her to the kitchen, observing how she moved through the space with economy of gestures. There was something hypnotic about the way she prepared the coffee, measuring the water, heating the kettle, organizing the porcelain cups with almost ritualistic care. "You knew I would come?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "I know you, Gabe. I've always known you." Hannah poured the boiling water over the coffee grounds, and the strong, familiar aroma filled the kitchen. "You never could leave things unfinished." She served the coffee in 2 cups and took him back to the living room, sitting in a floral fabric armchair that must have belonged to her mother. Gabe occupied the sofa across from her, keeping a safe distance between them. "This house," he began, looking around. "It's exactly as I remembered. I changed very little after Mom died. I like things as they were. I'm sorry about the loss of your mother, Joe told me." Hannah nodded, taking a sip of coffee. "It was quick, a stroke. She didn't suffer." They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of 20 years of separation hanging between them like a physical presence. Gabe observed Hannah over the cup, noting the small details that the distance at the cemetery hadn't allowed. The way she held the cup with both hands, as if she needed the heat to warm herself even in the scorching climate. The way her eyes always diverted when he tried to meet her gaze. The almost imperceptible tension in her shoulders, as if she were preparing to receive a blow. "Hannah," he finally said, setting the cup on the table. "About that day." "I know why you left," she interrupted him, her voice still soft, but with a firmness that admitted no discussion. "You were young, frightened, pressured by your family. I don't blame you for leaving." The ease with which she said that surprised him. Gabe had prepared himself for complex explanations, for emotional confrontations, for tears and accusations. But Hannah seemed to have made peace with the past in a way that he hadn't managed in 2 decades. "But you blame me for not saying goodbye," he said, and it wasn't a question. For the first time since he had entered the house, Hannah looked him directly in the eyes, and in that look there was a pain so deep, so old, that Gabe felt as if he had received a punch to the stomach. "I blame you for abandoning me when I needed you most," she said, her voice breaking slightly on the last word. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Gabe felt his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years, a mixture of guilt, regret, and something that dangerously resembled love. "Hannah, No," she shook her head, rising abruptly from the armchair. "I don't want to hear apologies. Not now, not after so long." She walked to the window that overlooked the orchard, her back to him. Gabe could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly as they rested on the sill. "Then why did you let me in?" he asked, standing up as well. "Why are you talking to me?" Hannah remained silent for a long moment, looking out the window at the blackberry bushes where they had spent so many afternoons of adolescence. "Because I need to tell you something," she finally said without turning around. "Something you need to know before you leave again." The tone of her voice made Gabe's blood freeze in his veins. There was something dark, definitive, in that phrase that filled him with a terrible premonition. "What?" he asked, taking a step in her direction. Hannah turned slowly, and when their eyes met, Gabe saw something that terrified him. There were tears running down her face, but she was smiling. a bitter, painful smile that didn't come close to reaching her eyes. "I've never been with another man, Gabe. In all these 20 years, I've never given myself to anyone." The revelation hit him like lightning. Gabe stood still, processing the words, trying to understand exactly what she was saying and why it sounded more like an accusation than a confession. "Hannah, do you know why?" she continued, wiping away the tears with the back of her hand, but maintaining that haunted smile. "Because every time someone tried to get close, I saw you. Every time someone tried to kiss me, I remembered your kiss. Every time someone touched me, I felt your hands." Her words were like stabs to Gabe's chest. He wanted to approach her, wanted to touch her, wanted to do something to alleviate the pain he saw stamped on her face. But he knew that any movement could break the painful spell of that moment. "You cursed me, Gabriel Foster," Hannah whispered, her voice loaded with a bitterness that seemed to come from very deep. "Cursed me to love you forever." Hannah's confession echoed through the room like a gunshot in the silence. Gabe was paralyzed, looking at this woman who had been his adolescent obsession and who now revealed herself as an open wound that had never healed. The weight of those words, "You cursed me to love you forever," fell on him like an avalanche of guilt and desire. "Hannah, that can't be true," he murmured, taking a hesitant step in her direction. "Why not?" she asked, wiping the tears with the back of her hand. "Because it's too convenient? Because it perfectly matches the romantic image you have of me? Or because it makes you feel important?" The acidity in her voice made him stop mid-movement. There was something dangerous happening there, a change in the tone of the conversation that he couldn't completely decipher. "It's not that," he said. "It's just 20 years, Hannah. 20 years is a long time to..." "To what?" "To wait for someone who never came back." She laughed, but there was no humor in that sound. "You're right, it's a long time, too long." Hannah walked to an old dresser that stood against the wall and opened one of the drawers. She took out a shoebox yellowed by time and brought it to the center table, placing it between them like a physical barrier. "Want to see how I spent these 20 years?" she asked, opening the box. Inside were photographs, letters, newspaper clippings. Gabe immediately recognized some of the photos. They were of him, taken during adolescence, many that he didn't even know existed. There were also clippings of articles about his company, about his business successes, about his life in New York. "I followed you," Hannah said, fingering the papers with trembling fingers. "Every achievement, every business deal closed, every time you appeared in the press. I knew where you were, what you were doing, who you were dating." Gabe felt a chill run up his spine. There was something obsessive, sick, in that revelation that made him question if he really knew the woman who stood before him. "Why did you do that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Because it was the only way to have you with me." Hannah held one of the photographs, him leaving an expensive restaurant in New York, accompanied by a blonde woman he no longer remembered who she was. "Because even knowing that you were living, building a life, being happy away from me, I couldn't let you go." She tossed the photograph onto the table, and Gabe could see that her hands were trembling violently. "Do you know how many men tried to approach me in these years?" she continued. "Dozens. The pharmacist's son who sent me flowers every Sunday for 2 years. The school's math teacher, who invented excuses to talk to me in the library. Dr. Simon, who started as the family doctor and ended up becoming something else." "Dr. Simon?" Gabe frowned. "Who is he?" "My doctor, my psychiatrist, my protector." Hannah smiled bitterly. "My jailer." There was something in the tone with which she said that which made all the alarms go off in Gabe's head. "What do you mean by jailer?" Hannah got up and walked to the window again, hugging herself as if she felt cold in the scorching heat of the Virginia afternoon. "Dr. Simon arrived here shortly after you left," she began, her voice distant, as if she were telling someone else's story. "My mother was destroyed after what your father did to her. Couldn't sleep, couldn't work, had panic attacks every time she left the house. He came as a savior." Gabe approached, feeling that he was about to hear something that would completely change his perception of everything that had happened. "He took care of her, medication, therapy, emotional support, and me too. I was destroyed, Gabe. You left without a word. My mother was falling apart. The whole town looked at us as if we were lepers. I was 18 and felt that my life had ended before it even began." Hannah turned to him, and there was something devastating in her eyes. "Dr. Simon saved me, but he also imprisoned me." "What do you mean?" "He convinced me that I was sick, that my sadness over your departure was pathological, that my inability to relate to other men was a disorder that needed to be treated. For years, I took medications that left me in a kind of emotional limbo, functional, but numb. Gabe felt the ground open beneath his feet. Hannah, but the worst wasn't the medications, she continued, her voice becoming harder. The worst was realizing years later that Dr. Simon wasn't treating me. He was molding me, transforming me into the ideal woman for him, dependent, grateful, incapable of loving anyone else. My God, he wanted me, Gabe, from the first day. But he was too smart to force anything. He preferred to wait, to break me down slowly until I had no choice but to give myself to him. Hannah laughed bitterly, a sound that hurt to hear. But do you know what his mistake was? He underestimated the power of obsession. Even drugged, even controlled, even convinced that I was crazy, I never stopped loving you. I never stopped waiting for you to come back. Gabe felt nausea rising in his throat. The image of Hannah being manipulated by a man who should have cared for her, being medicated and controlled for years, was more than he could bear. "And now?" he asked. "Do you still take the medications?" "I stopped 5 years ago, when my mother died. Doctor Simon tried to convince me that it was dangerous, that I would have a relapse, that I needed him more than ever. But for the first time in more than a decade, I felt free to make a decision on my own." Hannah moved closer to him, and Gabe could see that there was a new strength in her eyes, something that wasn't there at the cemetery or when he arrived at the house. "Do you know what I discovered when I stopped the medications? That I wasn't crazy. That my inability to give myself to other men wasn't a disease. It was loyalty. It was love. It was the certainty that, even if you never came back, I couldn't pretend to feel for someone else what I felt for you." They were just a few inches apart now, and Gabe could feel the heat of her body, the familiar perfume that immediately transported him back to 18. "Hannah," he whispered, raising his hand to touch her face. She held his wrist before he could reach her. "No," she said firmly, "not yet. First you need to understand something." "What?" Hannah's eyes shone with an intensity that made him tremble. "I told you all this not to make you feel guilty. I told you because I want you to know exactly what's at stake here. I'm not that 18-year-old girl you left behind anymore. I'm a 38-year-old woman who spent 2 decades learning to live with pain. And if you're going to stay, if you really intend to restart something with me, you need to know that it won't be easy. It won't be romantic. It will be intense, complicated, and perhaps more painful than pleasurable." Gabe swallowed hard. "And if I want to stay anyway?" Hannah released his wrist and took a step back, that bitter smile returning to her lips. "Then you'll have to prove it, and you'll have to fight not only with me and my past. You'll have to fight with Dr. Simon, with the entire town, and especially with yourself." She turned and began walking toward the door. "Think carefully, Gabe. Think if it's worth digging up ghosts that might be better left in peace." And then she left the room, leaving him alone with the box of photographs and the growing certainty that he had gotten into something much more complicated than he had imagined. Gabe spent the entire night awake, tossing and turning in the narrow bed of his childhood, while Hannah's words echoed in his mind like a scratched record. The image of her being manipulated for years, medicated against her will, kept in a state of emotional dependency by a man who should have protected her, was something he couldn't fully process. But worse than that was the growing certainty that he himself had been complicit in that horror, abandoning Hannah exactly when she needed him most. When the sun rose over the hills of Maple Ridge, Gabe had already made a decision. He needed to meet Dr. Simon personally, to understand exactly who he was dealing with and, if necessary, remove him from Hannah's life once and for all. The doctor's office was in an old house in the center of town, painted light yellow and surrounded by a well-maintained garden. A discreet sign at the entrance announced, "Dr. Simon Carter, Medical Clinic and Psychiatry." Gabe parked the pickup truck borrowed from Joe in front of the gate and observed the movement for a few minutes. It was just after 8 in the morning, but there were already some people waiting in the small waiting room that he could see through the window. Women mostly, some accompanied by small children, all with that expression of someone who depended on that place for some kind of relief. When he finally decided to enter, he was greeted by a middle-aged nurse who looked at him with poorly disguised suspicion. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, leafing through an already quite worn, leather-covered agenda. "No, but I would very much like to speak with Dr. Simon. It's about Hannah Lewis." The mention of Hannah's name made the nurse frown. "The doctor is in consultation. You can wait. but I don't guarantee that he will have time to see you today. Gabe settled into one of the blue plastic chairs in the waiting room, observing the comings and goings of patients. There was something in the environment that bothered him deeply. A sensation of excessive control, of people who arrived there not as clients, but as dependents on some kind of salvation that only that man could offer. It was almost 10 o'clock when Dr. Simon finally appeared. He was a man of distinguished appearance, around 60, perfectly combed grey hair, gold-rimmed glasses, and an impeccable white coat. There was something paternal in his posture, but also an authority that became evident in the way people addressed him. "Mr. Foster," he said, extending his hand, "I heard you would like to speak with me. I'm sorry for the loss of your father." The courtesy was perfect, but there was something in the doctor's eyes that Gabe couldn't decipher, something calculating, as if he were evaluating an adversary. "Thank you. Can we speak in private?" Dr. Simon led him to his office, a spacious room decorated with dark wood furniture and framed diplomas on the walls. There was an imposing desk in the center, 2 leather armchairs for patients, and a bookshelf filled with medical and psychiatric books. "Please sit down," said the doctor, settling behind the desk. "I imagine your visit has to do with Hannah." The direct way he addressed the subject surprised Gabe. "Yes, it has to do with her." "Hannah is a very special person to me, Doctor," Simon continued, interlacing his fingers on the desk. "I've been with her and her family for more than 20 years. I saw that girl grow up, face tragedies, overcome traumas that would destroy less resilient people." "And what role did you play in that overcoming?" Dr. Simon smiled, but there was coldness in that smile. "The role that any responsible doctor would have. I offered medical care, psychological support, emotional stability when she needed it most. Medication? When necessary, yes. Hannah went through periods of severe depression, anxiety crises, episodes of self-destructive behavior. The medication was essential to stabilize her condition." Gabe felt anger growing in his chest. The way the doctor spoke, as if Hannah were a clinical case and not a person who had been deprived of her emotional autonomy for years. "And now? Does she still need that medication?" Dr. Simon leaned back in his chair, studying Gabe with renewed attention. "Hannah is an adult woman, Mr. Foster. Her medical decisions are between her and me. But I can say that I am concerned about certain recent influences in her life." "Influences?" "Your arrival in town, for example. Hannah spent years building an emotional stability that, frankly, is fragile. The reopening of old wounds can be extremely harmful to her mental well-being." The threat in the doctor's words was subtle but clear. Gabe leaned forward, facing him directly. "Dr. Simon, I'll be direct with you. I've heard that your relationship with Hannah goes beyond professional." The doctor didn't blink, but Gabe noticed an almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders. "I don't know what kind of distorted information you've received, but I can assure you that my relationship with Hannah has always been strictly professional and paternal. I see her as a daughter that you kept medicated and isolated for years, a daughter that I saved from a depression that could have ended in suicide." Dr. Simon replied, and there was real hardness in his voice now. "A daughter that I protected from men who wanted to take advantage of her vulnerability. Men like me? Men like you, yes. Men who appear in her life, awaken hopes, make promises, and then disappear when the situation gets too complicated." The accusation hit Gabe like a slap, mainly because there was truth in it. But there was also something more in the doctor's words, a possessiveness that confirmed everything Hannah had told him. "And if I don't intend to disappear this time, Doctor..." Simon rose slowly, walking to the window that overlooked the garden. When he turned again, his expression had completely hardened. "Then you're being extremely selfish, Mr. Foster. Hannah has built a life here, a simple life, but stable. She has her work, her routines, people who care about her. Do you really think you have the right to arrive here after 20 years and destroy all that to satisfy some nostalgic whim? It's not a whim." "No? Then what is it? Love?" Dr. Simon laughed, but there was no humor in that sound. "If you really loved Hannah, you would have returned a long time ago. Or better yet, you would never have left." Gabe stood up too, feeling that the conversation was about to take a dangerous turn. "You don't know anything about what I feel for Hannah. I know more than you imagine. I know that you abandoned her when she needed you most. I know that you built an entire life away from here with other women, other loves. I know that you only returned because your father died, not because you missed her. And I know that when things get too difficult, you'll leave again." The doctor's words were like precise stabs, hitting exactly the points where Gabe felt most vulnerable and guilty. "You're wrong, am I?" Dr. Simon approached, and Gabe could perceive that, despite the civilized appearance, there was something dangerous about that man. "Then prove it. Stay. Marry her. Bring her to New York. Give her the life you always promised." "Maybe I'll do that." "No, you won't, because deep down you know that Hannah is no longer the romantic girl you left behind. She's a marked, complicated woman who will demand more than you're willing to give. And when you realize that, when the novelty wears off and reality hits, you'll do exactly what you did 20 years ago. You'll leave." Dr. Simon returned behind the desk, and when he spoke again, there was a terrifying calmness in his voice. "But this time I won't let you. This time I'll protect her from you, even if she doesn't want to be protected." The threat was crystal clear now. Gabe understood that he was dealing not just with a possessive doctor, but with someone who considered Hannah his property and was willing to fight to keep her. "Is that a threat, Doctor?" "It's medical advice, Mr. Foster, for the good of all involved, especially Hannah." Gabe headed for the door but stopped before leaving. "You're mistaken about one thing, Doctor. This time I'm not leaving. And if you try to interfere in Hannah's life in any way, you'll have to deal with me." Dr. Simon smiled, and there was something genuinely frightening in that smile. "I hope you're prepared for the consequences of that decision, Mr. Foster, because I can guarantee that they will be more serious than you imagine." The conversation with Dr. Simon left Gabe with a sense of urgency that he hadn't felt in years. There was something in the way the doctor had spoken, in the calculating coldness behind his civilized words, that made him understand that Hannah was in real danger. Not an immediate physical danger, but something more subtle and perhaps more destructive, the danger of continuing to be manipulated by someone who hid behind a mask of paternal protection. That afternoon, Gabe returned to the Blue House. This time he didn't hesitate to knock on the door, and when Hannah opened it, he could see in her eyes that she already knew something had changed. "You talked to him?" It wasn't a question. "I did." Hannah stepped aside for him to enter, but there was a different tension in the air, as if they were about to cross a line from which there would be no return. "And what did you think of our dear doctor?" she asked, closing the door behind him. "I think he's dangerous, and I think you know that." Hannah laughed, but there was no joy in that sound. "Of course I know. I've always known. But knowing and being able to do something about it are two very different things." She led him to the living room, but this time didn't offer coffee, didn't concern herself with courtesies. There was something urgent in the air, as if they both knew that this conversation would define everything that would come after. "He threatened me," Gabe said, going straight to the point. "He threatens everyone who approaches me. The difference is that this time he has real reasons to be afraid." "Why?" Hannah sat in the armchair, but kept her back straight, as if she were preparing for a battle. "Because you're different from the others. The other men who tried to approach were from here, depended on the approval of the community, had businesses or families that could be harmed if Dr. Simon decided to make their lives hell. But not you. You have power, money, influence. You can fight against him on equal terms." Gabe knelt in front of her armchair, placing his hands on Hannah's knees. It was the first time he had touched her since he had returned, and the electric contact between them was immediate and devastating. "So that's what you want? For me to fight against him?" Hannah looked at his hands on her legs, and when she spoke, her voice was hoarse with emotion. "I want you to prove that this time it's different, that this time you won't abandon me when things get difficult." "How?" She raised her eyes to meet his, and Gabe saw there a vulnerability so deep that it physically hurt. "Take me away from here. Tonight. Now." The simplicity of the answer surprised him. "Where to?" "It doesn't matter. To your house in New York, to a hotel, to the end of the world. Just get me out of this place where everyone thinks they know what's best for me." Gabe felt his heart accelerate. It was exactly what he wanted to hear, but he also knew that it wouldn't be that simple. "Hannah, if we leave like this, suddenly Dr. Simon might—" "Might what?" she interrupted, covering his hands with hers. "Have me forcibly committed? Spread lies about me around town? Destroy my reputation? He's already done all that over the years, Gabe. The only difference is that now I don't care anymore." There was a fierce determination in her voice that he hadn't heard before. I spent 20 years being the Hannah that everyone expected me to be. The obedient daughter, the docile patient, the fragile woman who needed to be protected from herself. I'm tired of that. I want to discover who I really am away from this place, away from these people who know me only as a victim. Gabe squeezed her hands, feeling the strength and determination that pulsed beneath the apparent fragility. And what if we discover that we're different people than we were 20 years ago? What if it doesn't work out between us? Hannah smiled, and for the first time since he had returned, it was a genuine smile, without bitterness or pain. Then at least I will have tried. At least I will have truly lived for a few days, a few weeks, a few months. It's more than I've had in the last 20 years. Gabe stood up, pulling her along. Suddenly she was in his arms, and the familiar smell of her perfume, mixed with the aroma of soap and something indefinably feminine, transported him immediately back to 18. "Hannah," he whispered, burying his face in her hair. "Don't speak," she replied, backing away just enough to look him in the eyes. "We've already talked too much. Now I need to know if you still desire me the way you desired me when we were young." The question was direct, without beating around the bush, loaded with an adult sexuality that the adolescent Hannah didn't possess. "More," he replied, his voice hoarse. "I desire you more than I've ever desired any woman in my life." She moved closer, pressing her body against his, and Gabe could feel every curve, every line, every point where she fit perfectly against him. "Then show me," she whispered against his lips. "Show me now before I lose my courage." The kiss that followed was explosive. 20 years of longing, repressed desire, and unrequited love concentrated in that moment. Gabe's hands explored her back, moved down to her waist, pulled her closer until there was no space between their bodies. Hannah responded with equal intensity, her nails lightly scratching the nape of his neck, her breath catching against his mouth. There was a desperate urgency in the way they touched each other, as if they were two drowning people, and each caress was a lifeline. "Are you sure?" he asked when they finally separated, breathless. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life," she replied, taking him by the hand and leading him toward the stairs. Hannah's bedroom was on the second floor, a simple but welcoming space, dominated by a wrought-iron bed covered with white sheets. The windows were open, and a gentle breeze swayed the cotton curtains, bringing the perfume of blackberries from the yard. When she began to unbutton his shirt, Gabe held her hands. "Hannah, are you sure you want to do this now? Here? We can leave first. Find a place." "No," she shook her head firmly. "Here, in this house where I spent so many years dreaming of you. In this bed where I cried for your absence so many nights. I want our first time to happen here, so that I can transform these painful memories into something beautiful." She continued unbuttoning his shirt, her fingers trembling but determined. When the piece fell to the floor, she placed her hands on his chest, exploring every muscle, every scar, as if she were memorizing their texture. "You've changed," she murmured, tracing an imaginary line between his ribs. "You're stronger, more man." "You've changed too," he replied, pulling her in for another kiss. "You're more beautiful, more woman." This time, when they touched, there was no hurry. Gabe explored every inch of her skin with almost religious reverence, kissing every mark that the years had left, every small imperfection that made her even more beautiful in his eyes. When they finally joined, Hannah closed her eyes and held his face between her hands, tears silently streaming down her cheeks. "I knew," she whispered. "I always knew that it was worth waiting." Afterward, lying entwined among the rumpled sheets watching the sun set through the window, Gabe felt a peace that he hadn't experienced in decades. Hannah slept nestled against his chest, breathing softly, and he could finally understand what he had lost by leaving 20 years ago. But the peace lasted only briefly. When the telephone rang on the bedside table, Hannah woke up startled, looking at the device as if it were a snake about to strike. "Don't answer it," Gabe said, pulling her closer, but she was already getting up, wrapping herself in a cotton robe. "Hello?" Her voice was cautious. Gabe couldn't hear what the person on the other end was saying, but he saw Hannah's face progressively pale. "I understand," she finally said. "Yes, I'll come." When she hung up, she turned to Gabe with an expression that mixed fear and resignation. "It was Dr. Simon. He wants to see me in his office. Now. Said it's urgent." Hannah dressed in silence, the mechanical movements of someone who was used to obeying urgent summons. Gabe watched from the bed, feeling a mixture of anger and helplessness growing in his chest. "You don't have to go," he said, getting up and starting to get dressed too. "He doesn't have any real power over you." "Yes, he does," Hannah replied, buttoning a navy blue dress with trembling fingers. "He has more power than you can imagine." "What power? He's just a small-town doctor." Hannah stopped dressing and turned to him, and there was something haunted in her eyes. "Gabe, there are things about Dr. Simon that I've never told you. Things that I don't even know if I have the courage to tell." A chill ran up Gabe's spine. "What things?" Hannah sat on the edge of the bed, her hands interlaced in her lap like a child about to confess a terrible sin. "He has documents, medical records, prescriptions, psychiatric reports, everything he wrote about me over the years, describing me as an unstable person, dangerous to herself and others." "So what? They're lies." "They are, but they're lies written by a respected doctor, with a valid license and decades of experience. If he wants, he can use these documents to have me forcibly committed. He can declare me incapable of making my own decisions. He can—" Her voice failed, and Gabe immediately understood the gravity of the situation. "My God, Hannah, that's blackmail. Worse than blackmail. It's a perfect system of control. He created a false medical history that would justify any extreme measure he might want to take against me." Gabe sat beside her, pulling her close. "Why did you never seek another doctor? Never contested these reports? With what money? With what influence? I'm the seamstress's daughter who made up stories about Colonel Anthony Foster. Who's going to believe my word against his?" The bitterness in her voice was palpable, and Gabe felt the crushing weight of his own guilt. If he hadn't abandoned Hannah, if he had stayed and faced the consequences of the scandal, none of this would have happened. "He won't do anything now," Gabe said, more to convince himself than to reassure her. "Not after what happened between us today. He knows I won't let him." Hannah looked at him with a deep sadness. "That's exactly why he's going to do something, because now he knows he's lost you forever." She got up and grabbed a small purse from the dresser. "I need to go. If I don't show up, he'll come here, and I don't want him to find out that you were with me." "Hannah, no, we're leaving now together. I'll get my things, you get yours, and we leave this town tonight." "And then what?" "He goes to the police, presents the medical records, claims that I was kidnapped by a man who is taking advantage of my mental instability. In 48 hours you would be arrested and I would be committed." The perverse logic of the situation was inescapable. Dr. Simon had built a perfect trap over years, and now he was ready to use it. "So what do we do?" Hannah approached him and held his face between her hands. "You stay here. I'll go to his office, listen to what he has to say, and then we decide the next step." "I won't let you go alone." "You have to. If he sees us together now after having talked to you yesterday, he'll know exactly what happened between us, and that will only make things worse." Gabe wanted to protest, wanted to insist, but he knew she was right. Any hasty movement could put Hannah in even greater danger. "Promise you'll come back?" he asked, kissing her softly. "I promise." But when Hannah left the house, Gabe had the terrible feeling that he was making the same mistake from 20 years ago, letting her leave when he should be fighting to keep her by his side. Dr. Simon's office was empty when Hannah arrived. The nurse had gone home and only one lamp was lit in the waiting room. The doctor received her at the door of his office, wearing a dark suit instead of his usual white coat. "Hannah, thank you for coming. Please sit down." She settled into one of the armchairs, noticing that he had closed the door behind them. There was something different in the air, a tension that she couldn't completely identify. "What's so urgent, Doctor?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. Dr. Simon walked to his desk and picked up a thick folder, placing it on the table between them. "This folder contains your medical history from the last 20 years, Hannah. Every consultation, every prescription, every psychiatric evaluation I've made of you." Hannah felt her stomach contract. "So what?" "So reading these documents, anyone would come to the conclusion that you suffer from severe bipolar disorder with episodes of psychosis and self-destructive tendencies, that you need constant medication and rigorous medical supervision." "But you know that's not true." Dr. Simon smiled, and there was something genuinely cruel in that smile. "The truth, my dear Hannah, is what is documented. And what is documented here is that you are a deeply disturbed woman who cannot be left alone." Hannah stood up from the armchair, feeling a wave of panic beginning to grow in her chest. "What do you want?" I want you to stop deluding yourself. I want you to understand that Gabriel Foster is not your savior. He's just another man passing through here who will use you and then leave. I want you to return to your normal life, take your medication, and stop fantasizing about a future that will never exist. And if I don't want to? Dr. Simon opened the folder and took out some documents, extending them to her. Then tomorrow morning I sign these papers, requesting your compulsory commitment. I allege that you're in a psychotic break, that you represent a danger to yourself and others. In 72 hours, you'll be in a psychiatric clinic in Richmond, where you'll stay for as long as I consider necessary for your recovery. Hannah read the documents with growing horror. Everything was there. False medical reports, accounts of erratic behavior, prescriptions for medications she had never taken. It was years of work, meticulously constructed for this exact moment. You're a monster, she whispered. I'm a man who loves you more than you can understand, he replied, standing up and walking toward her. I'm the only person in this world who truly cares about your well-being. This isn't love, this is sick obsession. Dr. Simon got close enough to touch her face, and Hannah instinctively backed away. Call it what you want, but it's the only love you'll have. Gabe will leave again, Hannah. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but he will leave. And when he leaves, I'll be here. As I've always been. Hannah looked at the documents in her hands, feeling the weight of the trap that had been built around her for years. And if I agree to stay, if I take the medications, behave as you want, never speak to Gabe again, then these documents disappear forever. You return to your quiet life, your job at the library, your safe routines, and I continue to take care of you as I've always taken care. Hannah closed her eyes, feeling tears burning behind her eyelids. It was an impossible choice, her freedom or her legal sanity. I need to think. There's nothing to think about, Hannah. Gabe has already caused enough damage in your life. I won't allow him to cause more. It was at that moment that the door to the office violently opened, and Gabe appeared at the entrance with his face contorted with anger. You won't allow what, you son of a bitch? Dr. Simon turned, and for the first time since Hannah had known him, she saw real fear in his eyes. How did you get in here? The same way I'm going to leave, through the front door. Hannah, come with me now. But before she could move, Dr. Simon picked up the phone on the desk. If you two take one more step, I'll call the police. I have documents here proving that Hannah is in a psychotic break and that you're coercing her. In 5 minutes, you'll both be arrested. Gabe looked at Hannah, seeing the desperation in her eyes, and understood that they were cornered. But then, in a decision that would change everything, he smiled. Go ahead and call the police, Doctor. In fact, it would be great if you did. Gabe, no, Hannah whispered. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, he replied, taking his cell phone from his pocket. And that's why I spent the last 2 hours making some calls to New York. Dr. Simon frowned. What calls? To my lawyer, to a private investigator who works for my company, and to some contacts in the press. Gabe showed the screen of his cell phone, where several numbers were in the recent calls list. I discovered some very interesting things about you, Doctor. The smile on Gabe's face had something predatory that made Dr. Simon take an instinctive step back. Hannah, still holding the false documents, looked between the two men with a mixture of hope and terror. What things? Dr. Simon asked, but there was a visible crack in his, until then, unshakable composure. Gabe walked slowly around the office, observing the diplomas on the walls, the books on the shelves, the expensive furniture that suggested a prosperous and respectable career. Well, first I discovered that you're not the upstanding doctor you pretend to be. My investigator found at least 6 ethical complaints against you filed with the State Medical Board over the last 15 years. All filed away, it's true, but all involving allegations of misconduct with female patients. Dr. Simon's face visibly paled. Those are slanders. Archived cases don't mean anything. No, but they show a pattern, Gabe continued, stopping in front of the doctor's desk. A pattern of predatory behavior that was systematically hushed up through political influence and economic pressure. Hannah felt her heart pounding in her chest. She had intuited that Dr. Simon was possessive and manipulative, but she had never imagined that his problems went beyond her. Second, Gabe continued, I discovered that you have a considerable debt with the IRS, tax evasion, underreporting of private consultations, misuse of public resources when you worked at the municipal hospital. All very well documented by auditors, just waiting for the right moment to become a criminal case. Dr. Simon sat heavily in his chair, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to maintain his composure. This has nothing to do with Hannah. It has everything to do with Hannah, Gabe interrupted him. Because I also discovered that you used clinic resources to investigate her. You hired private detectives, bought information from third parties, even bribed postal employees to intercept her correspondence. Hannah let the documents fall to the floor, her hands flying to cover her mouth. My God. But the best is yet to come, Gabe smiled, pulling up a chair and sitting across from the doctor as if he were in a business meeting, because the crown jewel was discovering that you forged not only Hannah's medical records, but also those of at least 12 other women in the region. The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Simon was visibly shaken now, sweat running down his forehead, despite the air conditioning in the office. 12 women, Doctor, all young, all vulnerable, all kept under your care through unnecessary medication and emotional blackmail. Some committed against their will, others prevented from working or relating normally. Hannah leaned against the wall, feeling her legs weaken. The extent of Dr. Simon's monstrosity was beyond anything she had imagined. My investigator spoke with 3 of them, who agreed to testify. Stories very similar to yours, Hannah. Forced medication, social isolation, threats of compulsory commitment. Dr. Simon finally found his voice, but it came out trembling and desperate. You can't prove any of this. Yes, I can. Because one thing you didn't know about me, Doctor, is that I never enter a battle without being prepared to win. Gabe took a small digital recorder from his pocket. This entire conversation is being recorded. Your threats to Hannah, your admission that you forged medical documents, everything registered and already sent to my lawyers in New York. Dr. Simon looked at the recorder as if it were a bomb about to explode. Besides that, Gabe continued, my contacts in the press are already preparing an article about the small-town doctor who built a harem of patients through medical blackmail. Very catchy, don't you think? Should get good ratings. You wouldn't do that, Dr. Simon whispered. The scandal would destroy not only me but all those women, including Hannah. It was Hannah who responded, her voice firm for the first time since she had entered the office. Yes, he would, and I would completely support him. She approached the desk, picking up the false documents from the floor and methodically tearing them up. You destroyed 20 years of my life, Doctor. 20 years that I will never get back. If exposing your sick scheme can save other women from going through what I went through, then let it be exposed. Dr. Simon stood up abruptly, a last spark of arrogance shining in his eyes. You don't understand. I protected Hannah. I kept her safe, stable, away from men like you who just want to use her and then abandon her. Without me, she would have destroyed herself a long time ago. Without you, Hannah replied, her voice loaded with a strength that Gabe had never heard before. I would have lived. I would have loved, suffered, made mistakes, got things right, but I would have truly lived. You stole that from me. You stole my youth, my freedom, my ability to trust myself. She turned to Gabe. I want to leave here now. Gabe stood up, but before leaving he addressed Dr. Simon one last time. You have 24 hours to leave town, Doctor. You can go wherever you want. Start a new life somewhere else. But if I find out that you tried to contact Hannah again, or any of the other women you victimized, I personally guarantee that you'll spend the rest of your life in jail. Doctor, Simon opened his mouth to protest, but Gabe raised his hand, silencing him. Oh, and just to be clear, I've already frozen your bank accounts through a judicial injunction. Allegation of using illicit resources for criminal purposes. You have access only to enough to buy a ticket away from here. You can't do that. I can, and I did. As I said, Doctor, I never enter a battle without being prepared to win. Gabe extended his hand to Hannah, who took it without hesitation. Together, they walked toward the door. Hannah, Dr. Simon called when they were already at the threshold. His voice was broken, desperate. You'll regret it. When he abandons you again, you'll realize that I was the only one who really cared about you. Hannah stopped and turned slowly. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but there was a firmness in it that surprised even Gabe. Doctor, even if Gabe abandons me tomorrow, even if I end up alone and heartbroken, I will still have lived more in these last few hours than I lived in all the years under your care. I prefer to risk loving and suffering than never feeling anything real again. She squeezed Gabe's hand. "And now I know the difference between love and obsession. Love liberates. Obsession imprisons. You never loved me, Doctor. You possessed me." Outside the office, Hannah finally collapsed. 20 years of tension, fear, and control left her body in a flood of tears that seemed to have no end. Gabe held her against his chest, letting her cry out everything she had kept inside for so long. "It's over," he whispered against her hair. "It's really over now." "How did you manage to discover all this so quickly?" she asked when she finally could speak. Gabe smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her wet face. "Money opens many doors, Hannah. And when you really want to protect someone you love, there are no limits to where you're willing to go. And now? What do we do now?" Gabe looked at the starry sky above Maple Ridge, feeling a freedom that he hadn't experienced in decades. "Now we live, the way we should have lived 20 years ago, without fear, without shame, without anyone telling us what we can or cannot feel." Hannah smiled through the tears, and for the first time since adolescence it was a smile completely free of shadows. "Where are we going?" "Wherever you want. New York, Miami, Europe, or we can stay right here and rebuild this town from scratch. The important thing is that we go together." They walked hand in hand down the deserted street, leaving behind not just Dr. Simon's office, but a whole life of manipulation, control, and fear. Ahead, the future stretched out like an open road under the infinite sky of Virginia. 6 months later, Hannah woke up to the sound of waves breaking on the beach at Virginia Beach. The apartment that Gabe had bought in Virginia Beach was on the top floor of a building facing the sea, with huge windows that let in all the golden light of the Virginia sunrise. She stretched out in the king-size bed, feeling Gabe's body move beside her, still sleeping deeply. The first months away from Maple Ridge had been an emotional roller coaster. Hannah had to readjust to a life without the rigid routines that Dr. Simon had imposed, without the medication that numbed her emotions, without the constant weight of fear and vigilance. Some days were radiant, full of discoveries and simple pleasures that she had forgotten existed. Others were somber, marked by anxiety crises and moments when she doubted if she really deserved all that happiness. Gabe was patient in a way that she had never imagined a man could be. When she woke up in the middle of the night in panic, thinking that Dr. Simon had found a way to take her back, he held her until the fear passed. When she felt guilty for having destroyed the life of a man who, in her confused mind, sometimes still seemed to have been her protector, he gently reminded her of all the other women who were now free, thanks to her courage. Dr. Simon had disappeared from Maple Ridge in the early morning following the confrontation, taking only a small suitcase and leaving behind a town in shock. The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of his crimes, and dozens of women began to come forward, telling similar stories of manipulation and control. The scandal shook not only the small Virginia town, but reverberated throughout the state, leading to changes in legislation on the supervision of mental health professionals. Hannah had involuntarily become a kind of symbol of the fight against medical abuse. Journalists wanted to interview her, lawyers sought her out for class action lawsuits, women's rights organizations invited her to speak, but she still didn't feel ready to be the public face of a cause, however just it might be. She first needed to learn to be just Hannah, without labels, without definitions imposed by others. Work helped in this rediscovery. Gabe had used his influence to get her hired as a curator at a specialized library of contemporary American literature, linked to a private university in Virginia Beach. It was a job that required knowledge, sensitivity, and independence, exactly what she needed to rebuild her intellectual self-esteem. But it was love that really transformed her. Not the idealized and romantic love of adolescence, but the adult, complex, and real love that she and Gabe built together. They sometimes fought, disagreed about big and small things, unintentionally hurt each other, but they always came back to each other, always found ways to reconnect, always chose to stay. Gabe had changed too. The company remained prosperous, but he had delegated much of the daily administration to his partners, preferring to work from home whenever possible. He discovered that 2 decades of business success meant nothing compared to the simple pleasure of waking up beside the woman he loved, of preparing breakfast together, of spending entire afternoons talking about books, movies, plans for the future. On that particular morning, Hannah left the bed silently and went to the balcony. The sea was calm. Some people were already exercising on the sand, and the sun painted the sky with shades of pink and orange that never existed in Maple Ridge. She held the envelope that had arrived the previous evening, still unopened, with the official stamp of the mayor's office of her hometown. "Bad news," Gabe's husky voice behind her made her turn. He was standing at the door to the balcony, wearing only pajama shorts, his hair tousled from sleep. At 42, he was still the most handsome man she had ever seen, but now he was also the most beloved. "I don't know yet," she replied, showing the envelope. "It arrived yesterday, but I didn't have the courage to open it." Gabe approached, embracing her from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Want me to open it?" Hannah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Gabe carefully opened the envelope and read the letter in silence. She could feel the tension in his muscles gradually changing to something that seemed like surprise. "What is it?" "It's from the new mayor of Maple Ridge. She wants to offer you the position of director of the new municipal library they're building. Excellent salary, total autonomy to assemble the collection, generous budget for cultural programs." Hannah turned in his arms, incredulous. "Is this serious?" "Completely. She says here that your courage in denouncing Dr. Simon inspired several reforms in the town, and that they want you to return as a symbol of the renewal of Maple Ridge." Hannah took the letter and read it herself, feeling a confused mixture of emotions. Part of her felt a deep satisfaction in being recognized and valued by the place that she had spent her entire life trying to leave behind. Another part wondered if she was ready to return, if she could walk those streets without being haunted by the ghosts of the past. "What do you think?" she asked. Gabe smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I think the decision is yours. But I also think that perhaps it's exactly the kind of challenge you need now. And you? Could you live in a small town after all this?" "Hannah, I could live in a cave in the middle of the desert if it were with you. The question isn't where we live, it's how we live." She looked again at the letter, then at the sea, then at the man who had transformed her life in ways that she was still discovering. "You know what impresses me most about this letter," she finally said. "What?" "It's the first time in my adult life that someone is offering me something because of my competence, not out of pity or manipulation. It's the first time that someone wants the best of me, not my worst." Gabe kissed her softly, a kiss that had the taste of fulfilled promises and possible futures. "So you're going to accept?" "We're going to accept," she corrected. "If we're going back, let's go back together. But this time, let's go back as people who chose to return, not as people who were forced to stay." 3 months later, they were back in Maple Ridge, but not to the town they had left. The investigation into Dr. Simon had been a catalyst for changes that went far beyond the medical area. A new generation of leaders had assumed power, bringing fresh ideas about sustainable development, women's rights, public transparency. The Blue House had been renovated and expanded, with Gabe insisting on keeping all the elements that were important to Hannah, but adding modern comforts and spaces for the books that were now an inseparable part of her life. The blackberry orchard was preserved, but gained benches and a small pergola where they spent afternoons reading together. The new municipal library was an ambitious project, built on the land where Dr. Simon's old office stood. Hannah had insisted on this, wanting to transform that space of pain into a place of knowledge and freedom. The building was modern, full of light, with children's reading rooms, an auditorium for cultural events, and a cafe that quickly became a meeting point for intellectuals from the region. At the inauguration, 6 months after her return, Hannah spoke to an audience that included state authorities, journalists, and practically the entire population of the town. She spoke about the transformative power of reading, about the importance of questioning authorities, about the right that every person has to write their own story. "This library," she said, looking at Gabe in the front row, "is not just a place to keep books. It's a place to keep dreams, questions, possibilities. It's a place where no one will tell you who you should be or how you should live. It's a place where you can discover for yourself who you really are." The audience applauded, standing. But Hannah only had eyes for the man who had made it all possible. Not because he had fought for her, although he had fought, but because he had given her something she had never had before. The certainty that she was loved exactly as she was, with all her wounds, fears, and imperfections. That night, lying in bed in the Blue House, listening to the familiar sound of crickets and feeling the warm breeze coming from the orchard, Hannah finally understood what it was to be truly free. "Gabe," she whispered in the dark. Thank you." For what? For coming back, for fighting, for not giving up on us. Gabe turned to her, and even in the dim light she could see the smile on his face. Hannah, I spent 20 years running away from the only place where I was truly happy. I wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. They kissed then, a kiss that had the taste of all the fulfilled promises and all the adventures yet to come. Outside Maple Ridge slept in peace, a town transformed by the power of love and the courage of two people who refused to let the past define their future. And for the first time in their lives, Gabe and Hannah Foster, yes, she had accepted his surname in the simple wedding they had in the town church, fell asleep with the absolute certainty that they had found the place where they belonged, next to each other, anywhere they chose to call home.